So let's get started. Welcome everybody to How to Raise Money and Pitch Investors. I'm David Helbraun. I am the founding partner of Helbraun Levey. I'm here with Andrew Fine, who is my partner and who chairs our corporate group. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, everybody.
Andrew and I have been part of thousands of capital raises, and we have talked to so many of you and investors, and we want to impart our knowledge to you today and talk to you about some of the things we've seen and what you should be thinking about when you're talking to an investor, how they talk, what they want, what you should be asking for. So when you're opening your next restaurant, you do it the right way. During this webinar, please feel free to use the chat box. We will answer questions if they're relevant and not cuckoo. Very rarely are they. And if I don't get to your question, we certainly will be answering questions at the end of the webinar. So moving on to the next slide. This is a legal disclaimer, which we always put in our slides, basically just saying that we're going to talk about a lot of stuff today. It's not legal advice, it's general advice. If you do have a question, you have a term sheet, you're wondering what an investor means by something, just send us an email, call us. We're happy to answer your questions. Go on to the next one, please. So we're opening up a new restaurant. That's what this is about. When we're asking how much do you need to raise, we're talking about a new restaurant. Andrew, how on earth do we actually know how much we're supposed to raise?
I think the best answer to that is it's always an educated guess. We always encourage people to work with financial planners, CPAs, professionals to come up with a business plan. People who've been in the industry a while tend to have a good, gut sense of how much to raise. The amount you need to raise really depends on the space you're targeting and the concept you're pursuing. If you're getting handed keys to a space that has never been a restaurant before, you're probably going to raise a lot more money than if you're getting handed keys to a built-out restaurant already. Whether or not the changes are structural, cosmetic has a big impact on the amount of money you need to raise. But if post-pandemic capital raising trends have taught us anything, raise more than you think you need. Nobody ever regrets adding a little bit of a buffer to a capital raise budget and raising more and having a little bit of more money in the bank, because costs are very unpredictable these days. A lot of cost of lumber during and post the pandemic was way higher than it had ever been. Build out budgets varied a lot year to year, and cost fluctuations can have huge impacts on the amount you need to raise. So building yourself a little buffer is always a good idea. You come in under budget, you're a hero. You need to raise money from investors and immediately take out a loan or ask investors for more money. It gets things off on a rockier foot. So it's a complicated question. Very few people have the clairvoyant ability to accurately predict how much money you need, but our advice is always err on the side of raising a little more than you think you need, or a little more than you've raised in the past.
What are you seeing as ranges for a typical Manhattan restaurant that's, I don't know, 2,000 square feet?
It really depends on whether it's built out, whether it's turnkey or not. I think that a lot of raises these days are low seven figures. You see restaurants opening for somewhere between 500 and 750 sometimes. But again, investors don't tend to blink when they see a seven-figure raise anymore, because that, on average, I think is what it takes to open
$1 million bucks, you mean, right?
Yep.
$1 million or more.
Yep.
Okay. We've also seen that GCs are charging more and showing up less frequently. Surprise, surprise. So not only do things cost more as far as the ingredients, let's say your lumber, all of your build out materials, GCs are also less reliable than ever, which adds money in the fact that it adds time.
Right.
There's two factors here. When you take longer to build out than you thought you would, that costs you money. And so that also needs to be taken into account when you're raising it. How do you value a company? So this is a question we hear all the time. I'm opening up this 75-seater. Um, I think I'm going to do 3.5 million, let's say 4 million a year, and I want to go raise some money. How on earth can I value a company before I open the doors?
It's a good question. Obviously, you'd want to work with your CPAs first and foremost, as opposed to me on that question. But the way to philosophically think about it with your investors is most of the time when you're raising money, you're giving investors a preferred return, meaning you're pledging the vast majority of profits to them initially. So when you're valuing a company, what's important in the hospitality world is figuring out what is the projected payback schedule for them, right? What percentage of profits are you pledging? It's very different than in other industries like tech or pharma, where you're basically telling investors you're going to make no money unless and until you make a whole lot of money all at once, right? In hospitality, it's a little different because you're paying investors back not through, a subsequent private equity investment necessarily or some kind of IPO. You're paying them back gradually over time through end of year distributions. So when you're talking about valuations, that's all well and good, and you can figure out what percentage you should sell. But whether you sell 30% of your company for 1 million or 40% for 1 million, that's not necessarily affecting when investors recover their capital. The most important metric for them is what percentage initially of profits are you going to pledge to investors, and when do they reach that point where they recover their money? Because at that point, whether or not they own 30 or 40%, everything else after that is just gravy for them. They've made back their investment. Now it's safe. So you see a lot
The
of
valuation
conversations
doesn't
about,
even matter really. What really matters is what percentage you're going to give up, and you can back into these things to your investors, and it's usually what between 20 and 40%.
Mhm.
And how quickly you're going to pay them back, meaning how you're going to take those profits and distribute them to the investors first over time. So getting hung up on valuation is really, you don't really need to get too hung up on it because you're going to plug in the numbers you want into your term sheet, right?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, you should have an accountant take a look at your projections and prepare those projections and make sure the valuation is grounded in reality, right?
Mm,
As much as, it's not necessarily what you lead with investors in the way that you do in a lot of other industries, right? Tech, it's all about valuation because that's how you make your money. In hospitality, it's not so much. That's not to say valuation is irrelevant or you can just make it up. It has to be grounded in some kind of reality. But when you pitch investors in hospitality, what you're really pitching is, hey, here's the payback schedule that we're projecting. Here's, how the interests are aligned. I don't make profits as an owner, as a founder, until you get your money back. So I'm
mm,
incentivized to pay you back as quickly as I can. And that tends to refocus, I think, the conversation around valuation to really being, okay, those first 5 years of operation are really pivotal because that will make or break whether or not investors get a return of capital.
hmm And as an investor, I want to see a couple of things, right? I want to see number one, that you are being realistic in the amount of revenue you think you can create from this restaurant. And two, you're also being realistic as to what the bottom line is going to be, because that's where I'm going to be taking my distribution. So, for example, if you have a 75-seat restaurant, you think you're going to do $10 million and throw 20% to the bottom line, as an investor, I would walk away from that deal because that is not a realistic projection. So you have to be very, very conservative and realistic. How do you how do you know the line to draw between being too conservative, where you're not going to get anyone interested, and being kind of over the top hopeful?
It's more of an art than a science, I think, right? It's important at the stage where you're raising money to really have a financial professional in your court, right? Because you could put numbers together and whether or not they're grounded in reality, you're going to think they're grounded in reality. But having that third party professional kind of rubber stamp it and say, no, I've worked on these deals. This is good. It gives you it legitimizes the numbers a bit more, right? To say,
Mm-hmm.
I'm working with a team of professionals that do this, that know what these numbers are, that know how these numbers have evolved, not just over the past 10 years, but particularly over the past two. Um, so just having that third party perspective and having a team of professionals that can kind of validate those numbers, I think is important. All projections are a little bit aspirational, right? The legal documents will take care of making sure investors represent to you, hey, we know, you know, we're not going to hold you to these numbers if they don't work out, as long as they're grounded in reality and they're relatively reasonable or possible at the beginning. We're not going to sue you if, God forbid, this doesn't work out. So it is a bit of an art. It's important to be realistic, but it's not necessarily a problem to come up with different kinds of projections. We've seen clients come up with aspirational projections and temper it with a conservative projection and say, hey, we've looked at comps. Maybe you're a chef or an owner who has a number of different restaurants and you're saying, look, we're looking at past operating history. This is what I think aspirationally we can do. Here's some different models. Here's a 3-year payback. Here's a 4-year payback. Here's a 2-year payback. I think it's going to be 3, but here's what it looks like if we over or undershoot.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything else you want to say about this slide?
Yep. No, it's important to know before you get too far along with investors. It's important to know what kind of concept you're opening, roughly the budget that you need to raise for the kind of space that you're looking at. It's important to come up with those metrics and have some ballparks before we get too far along the term sheet phase. We've seen clients many a time kind of rush through this process and go straight to a term sheet and get investor feedback and questions that they're not able to answer yet. And then that legal term sheet goes through 18 different iterations and the budget keeps changing and the investors see all these iterations and think, they don't really know what they need. And now I don't feel as confident as an investor. So make sure you put the time in on the front end before you start really pitching investors to understand what kind of business are you opening? What is the approximate budget that you need? It's okay if the budget changes a little bit here and there, but try to avoid drastic fluctuations because that signals to investors that, maybe things aren't as crystallized as they should be.
Gotcha. Okay, moving on. What's next? Debt financing. These are terms that are confusing versus equity financing. What is debt financing and who in the world can do debt financing?
Debt financing is basically raising money through loans as opposed to raising money through investments. We're talking about this briefly. The focus of this webinar is really going to be on equity investments, which are far more common for small businesses and particularly in the hospitality industry. But we do want to just explain what the difference is between debt financing and equity financing and to just help you understand what debt financing is, when and where it might be an option for you. And then kind of dig more into the equity financing side of things. Debt financing means you're taking out a loan, right? Loans have some pros, they have some cons. Loans are scary because you have to pay those back regardless of how the business is doing. You could go out of business, and depending on how you structure the loan, you might have to still pay that back, right? Whether it's collateralized by assets or whether you're personally guaranteeing it, meaning
there's always some collateral that no one's going to give you a loan without either a personal guarantee or a house or an apartment or another business behind it.
Institutions certainly won't. Sometimes, you have rich friends, colleagues, family members who will, but it's very, very rare that you're going to get a loan without pledging something in return, whether it's personal assets, whether it's assets of another business. Debt financing can become tricky because we see clients all the time go to banks saying, oh yeah, we'll collateralize it with this other business. But if that business has other partners or other investors who aren't involved with this new one, now that's a problem because you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. So debt is complicated, and for that reason, the only companies that are typically situated to really take advantage of debt financing are larger companies, right? That have a holding company that are commonly owned, and you can say, look, I have 8 locations, I have 10 years of operating history. I'm going to guarantee this entity that I set up for this location in Greenwich Village, and I'm going to support that obligation with the other 8 locations I have. That's the point where banks say, okay, you're not as much of a risk.
Yeah, we see clients who are in the $50 million plus hospitality groups oftentimes turn to debt financing because no one's personally guaranteeing anything. They're getting good terms from the bank with repayment terms that they can handle, and they're just collateralizing it with their holding company, meaning all their other restaurants. So sometimes that's a good way to go, especially at that size when you don't want to bring on any more partners.
Right. The pros to bringing on debt is exactly what David just said. You don't have to dilute yourself as a founder, right? You're putting a ceiling on what you're paying back. It's going to be principal plus interest. Theoretically what that amount is, right? And most of the time, depending on how the loan's structured, the faster you pay that loan back, the less you have to pay. Whereas if you bring on investors, those are your permanent partners, right? It's very rare that you have a way to get them out. Sometimes you can buy them out down the road, but you more or less are stuck with them. So it puts a lot of pressure on the relationship that you have with the investors, the people that you choose to partner with. And it means that, with every version or every location that you open, your cap table is probably going to get longer and longer. And there may come a point once you scale that you just don't want to add any more K1s to the mix. You don't want to add any more investors to the mix. So debt
Mhm.
financing becomes attractive, and without the risk, because you're collateralizing it, you're securing the loan with operations you've already built.
All right, let's talk about equity financing because that's really what we are interested in. That's what 95% of our clients are getting involved with. It's a fancy term. What does equity financing even mean?
Yeah, it means you're selling ownership in the company, right? You're giving investors a piece of the profits of the business permanently, in exchange for raising money at the front end. Investments are nice because your payback is contingent on profits. You're not guaranteeing investors anything. The way it works with investors is you give them a document to sign. It's called a subscription agreement, and they're basically saying, "Look, I'm giving up X number of dollars for Y percentage of your business. I'm agreeing to all the terms you're putting forward in this operating agreement, this partnership contract that you're sending me. But I recognize if the restaurant closes in year two and I don't get my money back, oh well." That's the long and short of it. It's more complicated than that, obviously, but the general gist is investors are taking a huge risk. There's a huge risk in that you'll never get your money back, but there's also huge upside because if you do get your money back, you are permanently a part of that business until the business closes, which it may never.
And we see all kinds of different investors. Investors, I'd say the majority of investors understand that they're not going to necessarily get their money back. They hope to get some of it back, maybe break even, but they like the idea of saying to their friends and family that they own a restaurant and they can get a reservation. It's a big component of the investor pool, the the sexiness of being involved in the restaurant industry. What we hear this term all the time, more so frequently, where everyone's throwing around ROI, ROI. What does that mean and why is that important? And can you explain that to us?
Sure. ROI stands for return on investment. So what it basically is saying is when an investor asks, what's the ROI? Let's say I'm an investor and I want to invest 100K in a restaurant. My first question is going to be, okay, what's your lease term? You have 10 years plus a 5-year option. So I probably have about 15 years of runway to make my money back. What's my ROI? If I invest 100K based on your projections, what's my total amount that I'm going to get over the course of that lease?
Mm.
And more importantly, how long will it take me to get that? And David raised some great points earlier. I'm going to take your projections as an investor. I'm sophisticated. I'm taking it to my advisors too, and I'm making sure that your projections are within the realm of reason. If they're not, if I feel like these numbers are made up or they're too aspirational, I'm probably not continuing the conversation.
Right.
So it's always a good idea, as much as projections tend to be optimistic, it's important to make sure they are grounded in reality, because if you present something that's totally out of line with how comparable deals tend to go, you're probably
You're,
losing trust
you're
before you really have a
toast.
chance to solidify the relationship.
Okay. I want to also talk about, in your example, raising 600,000 to sell 30% of your company. I do want to talk about how you come up with that percentage of equity that you're actually selling. Do you want to do that now or do you want to wait a minute?
You can do that now. I mean, it's this really has to do with your business plan and ultimately your valuation, right? You have to think about what are you projecting both profit wise and revenue wise for the first year, second year, third year, fourth year, right? If you're selling 600K for 30%, you can come up with a rough valuation there. It's important your accountant signs off on it so they can show their math. Your investors are likely to ask, how'd you come up with 30%? That's not a question your lawyer should be answering. Frankly, it's not even a question you should directly be answering. In a perfect world, you're saying, I didn't come up with it. My business advisor did, my financial planner did, my CPA did. Here's how we calculated it. I rubber stamped it. I can give you surrounding context. I can tell you my other restaurants, here's how it tends to go. But I got a professional who knows the industry, who thinks this is fair. And then that's when you pivot the conversation and be like, yes, you're getting 30%, but in most cases, you're offering investors a preferred return. So 30% isn't the number they should focus on. It's the 80% or 90% or 100% of
Yeah,
profits.
the preferred return is a big part of it. That to me, that's always how I can sell it because whether you give up 20, 30, or 40%, first of all, really depends on who you are and what your track record is and
Mhm.
how well known you are. We've got clients who are famous who can go out and raise $1 million for 10 or 20%, no problem. If you're a first timer though, and you've just, I don't know, had some gigs as an executive chef here or there, you're probably going out at 30 or 40 or even 50%. That's just how the market works, right?
Yep.
So the sale comes when you say, well, it doesn't really matter what percentage of the company you own. I'm paying you back 100% of the profits, and you're going to get that back over the first 3 years. And then you're just going to be cruising along making profits the rest of the way. That's how investors need to understand their investment.
Yep. That's it.
Equity financing advantages and disadvantages. So let's talk about why we do this over debt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You know, equity investments are nice because there are no promises attached to them, right? An investor is never going to put you out of business if you structure the deal the right way. You could project payback in 3 years, but things happen, right? COVID was a perfect example of that. People who took debt out during COVID went out of business because the loan doesn't care that it's COVID. If you have a contract with a bank to pay them back over time, it doesn't matter. Some banks will work with you, some banks won't. You're at the mercy of the lender to come up with that money. With an equity investment, you're basically telling them, look, this is what I'm projecting, but there are no guarantees. You may never pay investors back, but that's not necessarily going to close the business. So there's that element of risk that you're avoiding, right, of a premature closure. That's particularly important in hospitality because operators here know better than I do. Typically takes a couple years for a concept to really get off the ground, to find its feet, to find that profitability place, right? First few years, you're refining operations, you're tweaking the menu, you're figuring out what works and what doesn't, you're building a customer base. So investments are a little more forgiving in that there's no clock necessarily. You want to make sure that your projections are reasonable. If you're telling people, if you're telling investors, I'll pay back in 3 years, but then when you open the door, you're like, you know what, I don't want to make distributions for 10. That's a problem because you misrepresented something. But on the other hand, you know, you just make best efforts to pay investors back as quickly as you can without having that gun to your head saying, if you don't do what you say you're going to do, you're going to be out of business. The downside to equity investments, before I
Well,
get to the
let's talk
downside,
about the
David,
other
anything,
thing. Let's talk about the
anything
other
there?
positive things, which is
Yeah.
if you have a pool of investors, and we see this all the time, you get a pool of investors, you knock it out of the park in your first restaurant, you want to open number two, those people are right there. They're going to write you a check. They're going to come along for the ride if you want them to for the next one. We've had clients open up 5, 6, 10 restaurants with the same small group of investors because they've shown that they can make the money.
Mm-hmm.
So we like that. When people ask me, well, who's your ideal investor? I always say the same thing, which is a very wealthy uncle who has the deepest pockets in the world, who wants nothing to do with my business and just wants the best for me. That's your ultimate investor. Of course, they're hard to find, but people with money, real money, are great. It's kind of tough when you're raising money from people who are like, here's my $10,000. Boy, I hope I can turn this into something else, because they're going to be knocking on your door all day and all night. And you're going to feel bad when you can't pay them back, if you can't pay them back. What are some disadvantages of equity financing?
Yeah, so you know the relationship element of this that David just explained is a double-edged sword. If you have a good relationship with your investor, it's awesome. They might end up being more than an investor to you, right? They may end up being an advisor. You may end up calling them for advice. They may end up connecting you to people, right? Your interests are aligned with investors. We have clients, as David was saying, who've worked with the same group of investors for decades. And you know, even though they're passive and they don't technically have voting rights in their operating agreement, they function as advisors. They meet regularly, they go out to dinner, they talk about strategy and next steps. And you know, an investor with very deep pockets probably has interest in lots of different groups and can give you some perspective that maybe you wouldn't otherwise have. So it's very helpful if the relationship works well. Flip side of that is sometimes the relationship does not work well, right? And you get an investor who's breathing down your neck, who's questioning every spending decision you're making, who doesn't understand the industry, who's saying you're spending too much on ingredients. I want you to be a Michelin star, but I also want you to have the, inventory budget of a small pizza shop. And we see that all the time where investors just really don't get it and they only care about the money. That's a tough partner to have. And most of the time, when you take on an investor, you owe them a fiduciary duty, regardless of whether they're annoying or regardless of whether they're,
Andrew, nobody in the world knows what fiduciary duty means other than me and you. What does that even mean?
means you owe them a duty of care and loyalty. If you're managing a concept that other people invest in, you owe them certain obligations, right? To respond to their questions, to do what's in their best interest. The good news is, courts generally don't question your business decisions as long as they pass some kind of sniff test. But the downside is you are obligated to respond to them. You can't just ignore an investor, right? If you send them a P&L at the end of the year and they have questions, you got to sit down with them. And sometimes for our clients, ironically, it tends to be the 1% investor. The smaller investors tend to be the most annoying. As David was saying, the people who are writing $1 million checks have too much on their plate to really get into the weeds. They're going to either trust you or they don't. So consider who the investors you bring on are. More investors is not necessarily better. In fact, fewer investors tends to be better. Streamlines the cap table, fewer K1s, less mess, less fuss. So pick your investors carefully and make sure that you're philosophically aligned with them.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a good segue because when you take on investors, what you're going to ultimately need to do is come up with terms for their investment, not just financial terms. You want to understand, what percentage you're selling, what percentage of profit you're pledging, but investors sometimes come in with expectations. They're going to sometimes want a seat at the table. You have to figure out with them, what are their rights? If you open a second location, are they coming with you? Do they have to buy in? How does all that work?
Can we talk about an equity investment term sheet? Do you want to talk about the different parts of it? At least
that's where I'm going now.
At least the parts where our clients can negotiate themselves. Because the reality of the situation is you're going to be out there, client, pitching investors. You're not going to come to us and have us pitch anything. Hopefully you come to us first and we get your term sheet together. But if for some reason we don't, you need to know the basics. Andrew, what are the basics of a term sheet?
Yeah, so basically every slide from here on out is designed to explain what the basics are of a term sheet. Okay. This slide explains kind of the timeline of what a raise looks like. As David was saying, the first place we like to start is an equity investment term sheet. Ultimately, all of your investors will have to sign what's called an operating agreement. Most of you know what those are. For those that don't, it's basically a partnership contract. Anybody who owns equity in your company will have to sign this. It's long, it's complex, there are lots of legalese. It's one of the most important documents you sign. Something goes wrong down the road, the operating agreement's designed to answer it. Think of it as an insurance policy. It's a rule book. It's the Bible of the business to decide when something happens, how do you respond? Who approves decisions? It's often your best line of defense against partners who want to sue you or investors who are annoying or investors who think they're entitled to something that they're not. Putting the rules of the road in place first is really, really important. Don't fall prey to investors who are comfortable dangling a check in front of you before they sign anything. They're signing something for your protection, not the other way around necessarily. So we see a lot of instances where an investor says, oh, here's my 100K, I'll wire it to you right now. And you think, I'll figure out the contract later. And then down the road, by the time you sign the contract, the investor's making all these demands. What leverage do you have to say no? You already took their money. So coming up with a term sheet first, make sure that all the parties are on the same page from the get-go. And it helps weed out the investors that are serious, that believe in you, that are investing for the right reasons, from those investors who might not really understand what you're going for or know the hospitality industry very well.
And timing matters here because all these three things are on this slide, because when you're going out to market, and that's what we call it, you're going out to market with a couple of things. You've got your business plan fully fleshed out, all the numbers, all your financial projections, and you're seeing if there's an interest. If there's an interest, you're giving somebody a term sheet. You're saying, okay, great, you're interested, here's my term sheet. When you give someone your term sheet, your operating agreement, this Bible, and this subscription agreement, which Andrew will explain in a minute, should be done. They should be prepared, because now you're fishing. And when you're out there fishing with term sheets, and someone says, you know what, I'm in for 250. You don't want to then have to go to the table and start drafting documents and wait 2 weeks before you reel in this potential fish. You want to be able to hit them with an operating agreement right away, as soon as they sign the term sheet, and get that money in the bank. Because as you know, when you're raising money, the first money in is the hardest. But once you start gaining momentum and you start gaining and putting more money into the bank, it becomes easier and easier to raise the money. Andrew, what is a subscription agreement and why does that matter?
Subscription agreement is an investment contract. Basically says I, an investor, am investing X number of dollars for Y percentage of the company, and I agree that this is risky. I agree that there are all these risks inherent in what I am doing. I agree that if I don't get my money back, I'm not going to be destitute, right? I'm not mortgaging my house for this. I'm not going to sue you if something goes badly. It's basically, think of it as an insurance policy for the company. When you're raising money, I won't go into the whole securities regulation landscape here.
Please do not.
But you have to basically, as an issuer of securities, as someone who's selling equity, you have to satisfy certain rules in order to not register your capital raise with the Securities and Exchange Commission. As crazy as that sounds, right? The SEC has enough to deal with all these publicly traded companies. Even small fries, even small raises, even small businesses have to comply with certain securities rules. The subscription agreement makes sure that you're doing that. It's asking investors for the representations that you legally need to secure from them. It's making sure that they check enough of the legal boxes that you can take their money without looking over your shoulder and worrying about regulatory compliance. Okay. So it's very important to do that. It also helps offset any bogus complaints that investors may get you down the road. We've seen it time and time again where an investor is all smiles and handshakes at the front end, but if you don't meet your projections, sometimes they come out guns blazing. Right? And they say, what the hell? You promised this. You said this. You said this. Most of the time, we as company counsel will point to the subscription agreement and say, look, we did our best. There were unforeseeable circumstances or, whatever the case. But you signed an agreement acknowledging that this was a possibility. So, you're saying you were blindsided by this. You're saying this is unfair. But ultimately, you signed a document that undercuts every single ridiculous argument you're trying to use to shake us down for more money.
Okay.
So it's a very important thing to get them to sign for a variety of reasons.
Basically, if you ever read that document, it just says, this is crazy. Investing in restaurants is a bad idea. You might lose all your money in different ways.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
All right. What's the rules of the raise, Andrew?
So again, not to get too in the weeds with securities regulation. Again, every raise is a little different. But in order to stay within the so-called friends and family category, which is basically just saying you're going to contract directly with these investors and you don't need to involve state or federal regulatory authorities, there are a few things to keep in mind. You want to keep the investor count low, right? The fewer investors you have, the more likely it is you're in that friends and family category. People who want to raise $1 million, $10,000 at a time, that's tough, right? Because if you bring on too many investors, you're probably not in the friends and family category anymore. And there are additional hurdles you need to clear, filing paperwork with state and federal regulators. You don't need to go through a formal public offering, but there are intermediate steps you need to take that are expensive, that are time consuming, that can otherwise be avoided if you set the minimum investment high enough and you comply with some of these other requirements. You want to stay within your network generally. You want to have personalized conversations with them. Don't use brokers. Try to sit people down face to face, whether it's in person or virtual. Make sure you make yourself available to them. Don't use third parties. You want to make sure that everybody you bring in has a direct line to you, because the relationship between you as an issuer and the investor is really important. That's one of the most important factors for whether or not this is considered a friends and family raise for purposes of securities regulation. Last but not least, and perhaps most importantly, do not publicize your raise. The second you post about it on Instagram, it becomes the public offering, right? The second you post on your website, it becomes a public offering. There are ways to do that, right? Crowdfunding exists. There are public offering options, but believe me, it's about 5 times more expensive and 20 times more time consuming to do it that way. And we've seen private placements that proceed along one track and one Instagram post It means we have to follow another route. You need to raise more money, and the compliance becomes a real headache.
Mm-hmm.
So think of the raise as this is an exclusive group you're going to. You're not taking any old person off the street. You're selectively targeting partners for this operation and potentially for future operations. So treat those relationships with sanctity and make sure that you're corresponding only on private channels of communication.
Right.
Yeah.
So we talked about this a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and that is the question is, how much of my company do I need to give up to raise the money that I need?
Yep. Yeah, we talked about it. I mean, it's typically 20 to 40%. It can vary, right? A lot has to do with your leverage, has to do with your business plan, your payback structure, what preferred return you're offering. But generally, it's somewhere between 20 and 40%. I'd say a typical capital raise for a single restaurant, you're selling around 30% on average. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. But this is something you really want to work with your accountant on to make sure that they're rubber stamping whatever valuation you're putting on it. We're giving you kind of the bookends on what the range typically is.
Yeah, and we can advise you based on what we're seeing in the market,
Mm-hmm.
which is a big part of what you're doing. For example, if you're coming out of the gate thinking that you're going to raise $1 million for 10%, we're going to tell you that there's very little chance of that happening just because the market doesn't bear that kind of numbers.
Right. Right. And sometimes we come at the opposite side. We've seen, clients come to us and say, hey, I'm selling 75% to investors. And my first question to them is why? You don't
Right.
necessarily need to. So we'll let you know if you're underselling, we'll let you know if you're overselling based on where the market is right now. But there is an art to this, and we're happy to kind of advise you on what's fair, what's not, what does the market right now say about that.
Mm-hmm.
As we were saying earlier, it's very hard to talk about the percentage that you're selling out of context of the preferred returns. Preferred returns is just a word to basically mean that you're giving investors the majority of profits until they recover their capital.
Let's
So it's a
talk
way to
about
accelerate
preferred
their payback.
returns so people actually understand what it means.
Sure.
Because let's just say in a typical equity investment, you are selling 30% of your company
Mm-hmm.
to your investors. You're keeping 70%. In a normal, regular company, if nothing was done and there were profits at the end of the year, you would take 70% and your investors would get 30%. It would just be divided based on your percentage ownership.
Mm-hmm.
Preferred returns are a little different. Explain.
Yeah. So in that example, let's say you're bringing on a group of investors for 30% equity. You don't have to pay them 30% profits, right? The nice thing about LLCs, and keep in mind, this really only works when you have LLCs. If you have an S Corp, you can't do this. So we've said in a lot of other webinars, you probably heard us advise you, to the extent you're a client of ours, try to form LLCs and not S Corps in most cases, particularly if you're raising money through them. S corporations don't allow you to do this, only LLCs. LLCs are nice and flexible and afford you some different options when it comes to raising money, and this is one of them. So what you're saying is if your investors as a group own 30% of the company, you can still give them 80% of the profits, right? Because you're accelerating their payback. You're giving them more profits than their equity percentage would otherwise deserve. Why would you do that? It helps you justify giving them a lower percentage of the company in the long haul. One of the most important things investors are going to worry about is how long will it take me to get paid back? If you're paying everybody along ownership lines, you're probably going to have to sell a higher percentage of the company to make sure they get paid back quickly, right? If I'm only getting 30% of profits, it's going to probably take me 7 or 8 years to get my money back as opposed to 3. And investors in the hospitality industry really want to see projections that have payback somewhere within the 3rd or 4th year.
Why is that so important in the hospitality industry? Why do investors freak out about getting their money back more quickly?
A couple of reasons. Hospitality is risky, right? A lot of things could happen. We've seen the pandemic was a perfect example, right? You have some of your most successful, well-reviewed restaurants out there. Hospitality concepts are fragile. You never know what's going to happen. A pandemic could come and close something that's running very well, right? A landlord could sell a building and you could get kicked out. You could have a lawsuit that puts you prematurely out of business. Anything could happen that could shutter your doors. So the sooner they get paid back, the less risk they have that they're not getting a return on their investment, their ROI. So it's important to assure them, hey, we're prioritizing this. I, as a founder, don't get the lion's share of profits until you have gotten your money back.
Right.
It's a way to align interests. As David was saying, the market and standards of this industry really drive a lot of these deals. Preferred returns are very, very standard. It's very rare we see a deal without one. There's variance on what that can be, and we'll go into that. But it's a good way to align yourself with investors. And if all goes well, you can justify selling a lower percentage of the company than you otherwise would have to if you had, let's say, an S corp and sold 50% and they got 50% of profits forever.
Yeah, I mean, the pitch conversation really ends up centering a lot around how quickly you're going to get paid back.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like that with every industry, but it certainly is with ours. Let's go on to the next slide, unless you have anything else to say about this. Management fees. So a management fee means a lot of different things. In this particular situation, you are talking about a fee to the person who is doing two things, right? They're both running the restaurant, the company, and they're also running the LLC,
Mm-hmm.
which is doing all the stuff in the back office, dealing with K1s, dealing with accountants, compliance with local and state and federal laws. All that junk is
Mm-hmm.
also part of running the company, and that's included in this management fee, correct?
That's right. A management fee, another word for it is guaranteed payments. When you own equity in an LLC and you want to take a salary, it's basically a salary. It's just called something different from a tax standpoint. So think of a management fee as the salary that the founders are taking. We put this after the preferred return slide because it's important to understand we see deals all the time that pledge 100% of profits to investors first. That's not to say that the owners and operators aren't getting paid in the meantime. What you're saying is they're getting paid a salary that's paid and calculated as an expense, meaning it's paid before profits are calculated. So you could have a situation where 100% of the profits are going to investors, but obviously you got to live, right? You got to make enough money to pay the bills as an owner operator. That's where the management fee comes in. It's very important to include this in both the term sheet and the operating agreement to avoid situations where investors say, wait a minute, I thought I was getting all the money first. Why are you getting paid too? Hopefully you don't have to explain that to investors and they understand that, you got to live and you have to eat too. But it's important to explain to them very clearly that while the preferred return might exist, you're still getting a guaranteed minimum payment that functions as a salary for the work that you were doing. Disclose that, make sure there are parameters on what it is. Can you increase it year over year? What's the ceiling on it, if any? Get ahead of that because this is one of the issues that tend to come up years down the road after signing the operating agreement where investors raise questions or, give you a headache. We always like to get ahead of this conversation at the term sheet phase.
How did 5% become the go-to number here?
Honestly, I don't know how it became the go-to number, but it is the go-to number. We've seen management fees higher than that. We've seen management fees lower than that. 5% is very standard, and it assumes that somebody's there devoting most of their time and attention to the concept. We don't necessarily see 5% fees if you're a management company that operates 100 restaurants and you're there, once a quarter. Your P&Ls probably won't, your labor costs probably won't support a 5% fee. But if you're really there giving most of your time and energy to the concept, 5% tends to be very standard. Think of that 5% in relation to your overall labor costs. We get this question a lot. What should my management fee be? And let's say you're a chef who's working there full time. And I say, well, back into it. Well, if you weren't here, what would you have to pay an executive chef off the street to do your job?
Yep.
Right. And the last bullet on this PowerPoint is important because we like to say a lot of operating agreements out there say 5%. That's great. That's standard. What we like to do is take it a step further and say it's going to be the greater of two numbers. It's going to be 5% or a certain minimum each year. That way, if you have to close, if something happens, you have a down year, you at least have the benefit of a guaranteed minimum that's paid regardless. Again, I keep using COVID as an example of why some of these are important, but COVID serves as an example of how unpredictable the future is. You never know what's going to happen. A lot of things happen that are bad that also aren't your fault. So having that guaranteed minimum and making it the greater of those two numbers with an annual true up is a good way to make sure that you're taken care of.
Here's a question from Eli. If you work there all the time in a position that someone else would normally have to work if you were not present, is it possible to take a yearly salary as well as a 5% management fee as an owner?
Is it possible? Sure. Does that make sense? I don't know, right? You tell me. You want to look at your overall labor cost. So if you're double dipping, if you're paying yourself a guaranteed minimum plus 5%, does that make sense? What's the total comp that's being paid to you, and is that fair? Remember that if you have investors and you're paying yourself way above and beyond what market is, you have a duty of care and loyalty to them. Our investor is going to say, wait a minute, you're diluting our profits by overpaying yourself. The answer might be yes. The answer might be no. So just make sure, I wouldn't look at it as what's a management fee versus a salary. A management fee is a salary. So I would be more concerned with what is that dollar value, and does that make sense for who you are, the work you're doing, and what it would cost to replace you?
Yeah, look, if you're the chef and you're not hiring an executive chef or anybody to be in charge, and you're working the kitchen every single day, and you're also running the company and dealing with all the back office stuff, that might give you decent reason for either bumping up your minimum or increasing your percentage from 5 to 6 to 7. Taking both, though, is not something that I've ever seen. You don't
Mm-hmm.
take a salary and a percentage. It's very rare.
Yep.
All right, what's next, Andrew?
All right. Intellectual property is next. Of all the things that get omitted from deals accidentally, this is probably the big one. Over the years, I've become more and more obsessed with this point than any other point in the term sheet. Clients that work with me are probably surprised at how early I ask questions related to this, even before management sometimes, even before voting. Sometimes I talk about this because economies of scale are king right now. Everybody cares about the brand. Everyone cares about how you're going to scale. And from the investor seat, they especially care about that because investors who make the most money off hospitality brands get into the ground floor of something that grows. But their involvement in that growth, their entitlement in that growth comes down to who owns the intellectual property of the business. Intellectual property is basically a fancy word for saying a brand. It's everything that makes your restaurant unique. It's its name, it's its logo, it's its trademark, it's the look and feel of the restaurant. It's any unique recipes. It's everything in the totality of what makes your restaurant your restaurant. Somebody goes out and creates a carbon copy and changes certain different aspects, but a customer looks at it and be like, this is the same restaurant. They're probably infringing on your intellectual property. So it's a very important asset that's not tangible, but it is probably the most valuable asset of the successful hospitality brand. So figuring out from the get-go who owns this is important. If you download a LegalZoom form or you use certain lawyers to draft these agreements, you'd be surprised how often the company does not, or the operating agreement does not talk about this. If you don't talk about it from the get-go, the default is everybody who owns interest in the company owns the same interest in that brand. So the way I ask clients about this to start is I ask them, when you're talking to investors, what are you telling them? Are you telling them they're investing in this single brick and mortar? This brick and mortar closes, that's it, thanks so long? Or are you telling them they're getting involved at a brand level and that they're going to grow and scale with the business? Because the answer to that question will tell me who needs to and who does own the intellectual property.
Yeah, I mean, that really is an important question. And your default going into any negotiation should be that you as the creator and the manager should own all of the IP. And a lot of investors will accept that. Some of them won't. It really depends on how you're pitching it. If your pitch is we're opening up an expensive restaurant, it's going to be a one-off, then you'll get the IP. If you say, look, I'm opening up this one and then I want to open up 3, 4, 5, investors are going to want a piece of that. So
Right.
it really depends on what your model is.
Yeah, I mean, if you're telling investors, look, we're going to scale, you're investing in a scalable brand, you're basically telling them, hey, you're going to get in at the brand level and the company owns the IP. For certain concepts, sharing IP with investors is almost inevitable if that's what you're pitching to them, right? If your valuation assumes growth, you have to share the IP. If it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't, if you're saying, look, I might scale this, and if I do, good for me and good for the brand, but your investment has a ceiling on the amount of revenue that this single location can do.
Yep.
It's very important to get ahead of that. We've seen so many litigations over the years where, you know, it's not really expressly talked about, and investors look at Eater and figure out, oh my gosh, you're opening a new location in Florida. Why wasn't I involved? What the heck? I looked at your deck that was attached to the subscription agreement I signed 8 years ago, and you talked about expansion. I invested on that basis. Where's my chunk? Where's my piece of that new location? So if the intention is, you know, you're going to limit an investor's investment to a single brick and mortar, your valuation should be affected by that. And the terms of your deck, everything that you present to investors have to make that crystal clear. Because the default, if you don't, is that they own the brand with you and that they have some kind of entitlement to future expansion. They're not necessarily going to own the same percentage in every restaurant. It can get diluted over time if you need to raise more money and bring on other partners. But it's important to establish this from the get-go. I'd say that this is one of the top 3 mistakes hospitality owners make when they raise money, is not putting enough time or thought into this concept specifically as it relates to expansion. A potential compromise here is to say, look, you're investing in this single location only, but if I open a second location and I need to raise money, I'm coming to you first, right? You give them what's called a right of first offer. So that way that you're opening the door to them to continue to grow with you, but it's a pay-to-play situation. They don't get any automatic interest in it. They have to continue to invest on the same terms that you would offer to some other investor who's not involved yet. And that way they at least have a foot in the door and they have preferential treatment with respect to those pitches. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It really depends on your leverage, how you're pitching this, what you're envisioning. If you don't have an expansion plan, you're much more likely to say, look, I'm opening a high-end restaurant on this location, and that's kind of all I want to do with this. Okay, the IP ownership isn't that important. If you're opening a fast casual and you say, I want to open 10 of these in 5 years, IP is very important.
Okay, I think we got it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on to voting rights. So when you talk about voting rights, you mean that if the LLC wants to take action, maybe take a loan, maybe, I don't know, what kind of things come up that people even care about voting rights? Give me some examples of issues that pop up that people need to vote on.
Yeah, so the overwhelming default when you're doing a raise in the hospitality industry, you know, investors don't know how to run a restaurant or a bar or a hotel most of the time, right? It's understood that the vast majority of day-to-day decisions are going to be made by the founders and the managers. So when investors talk about voting rights, what they're really talking about is veto rights over a select few decisions. They don't want to sign a deal and then have you change the deal on them the next day. They don't want to sign a deal that says you're going to take an 100K management fee and 6 months in have you increase that to 200K without them, right? They don't want to sign a deal where you could sell, you know, the business in year 1 and leave them stranded with someone else. So there are certain protections that they're going to want. The way this typically works is you establish that default, that investors have no voting rights of any kind, and you're controlling the business. Usually investors have certain exceptions baked into that. Let's say you're selling 30% to investors and we're talking about voting rights. A common framework in that situation is to say, for certain major decisions, we can outline what those typically are, the managers have to consent plus maybe 50% of that investment group, right? So the holders of 15% of the company, of the 30%, have to agree. That way, you don't need everybody to agree. You might have an investor who objects, but at least enough investors in that group have to consent so that I, as an investor, feel like my interest, my financial situation is represented at that table.
Mm-hmm.
Major decisions tend to include, you know, any dilution event, a sale of the business, changing the operating agreement in a way that affects the rights of the members, you know, increasing management fees. There's a standard list. This can be long, this can be short. It really depends on who the investors are and how experienced the operators are. If you're an inexperienced operator, your investor, depending on who they are, may want more involvement in certain things as a check on you. We've seen situations where inexperienced operators, you know, partner with somebody who's an investor, but also kind of an advisor. And those advisors may negotiate things like, we want to look at the budget every year. We want to have a conversation with you. We want to advise you on these things because that's part of why you're bringing me in, is to advise. It really depends on the relationship. And, giving investors voting rights isn't necessarily the end of the world, but you do want to make sure that you're not requiring unanimous consent of everybody and inviting deadlock. And you do want to make sure that if you're giving voting rights away, you're very careful with who you bring in as an investor. If investors have voting rights, make sure you know who you're getting in bed with, and you understand whether or not your philosophies are ultimately aligned here.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. And to that point, it's a good segue into just making sure you pick your investors carefully. When investors sign their investment contract and they fund the money, that's not necessarily the end of the conversation. Right? There may be situations where you need things from them, whether that's approvals for certain things, whether that's disclosures for the SLA, whether that's, cooperation with any governmental filings or audits. You need to make sure in a small, privately held company, nobody's going to disappear on you. It's very hard in a situation where, let's say, you need to renew your liquor license and you need them to affirm something, and, they're in Fiji for 6 months and you can't reach them. We've seen situations happen like that, and it puts you in a tough spot. So make sure that whoever you bring on, you have a clear line of communication with, and you have a rapport with them so that if they're going away or if they're going to be unreachable for a little while, they let you know, right? In the same way you would let them know. It's very much a two-way street, and a lot of the regulators, particularly the liquor authority, isn't all that sympathetic to the fact that, I don't know, this is an investor who's passive. I don't know what they're doing right now. They're not going to care. They're going to say, great, I need a personal questionnaire for them, or I need them to submit this in 14 days, or your license will be suspended. So make sure that when you bring people on, you have a good sense of who they are, and you're confident that they're going to respond to you. Our contracts require them to do that, right? So contractually you're protected, but you don't want it to come down to a contract. You don't want a legal letter to be necessary to compel them to just get back to you. So just something to keep in mind as you're pitching investors and talking to them. It is a two-way street. You're trying to sell yourself to them. You're trying to sell your concept, but you're also testing the relationship. If they're not, responsive to you, if they feel, they make you feel bad, or you don't feel like they're really bought into what you're trying to do, maybe it's not a good fit. And we've seen many clients who, accepted people who they didn't feel good about because they really wanted the money, only to regret it later.
Right. Okay. How do you get rid of people? I mean, we have so many investors in our lives that just create problems for our operators. Either they're trying to be too involved, or they're trying to do things that they're not qualified to do, or they're trying to make moves that are not allowed in the operating agreement. We've seen it all. And sometimes we get to a point where it's just not worth having this person in the company. How do we remove or buy out an investor?
The default rule is you can't, right? The default rule is if somebody, regardless of what they do, right, if they own interest in a company, it's very, very hard to forcibly remove them, right? That's not really a remedy a court's ever going to award in most cases. It really comes down to, do you have a right to remove them based on the contract that they sign? That's what the law says. The law says you can't remove somebody once somebody is, owns equity in a company. It's like a marriage, right? You have to go through a very formal divorce process. You got to buy them out, and it's very expensive, and they have to agree, unless the contract that they sign provides an alternative. So the best scenario in these circumstances is to come up with a bad actor clause to say that if you have an investor or a member or somebody who, let's say, is doing something heinous, is embezzling from the company, you have the right to remove them at no cost. Somebody does something so heinous that they become a liability to the company, you want an equity forfeiture clause. How do we get investors to be okay with that? We represent investors all the time too, and sometimes we like to see that in there. Because if I'm convinced my client's not going to steal from the company and another investor does, not only is that money out of my client's pocket, but the company's going to have to pay for a buyout for that person. So that punishes the investor twice. So sometimes we're negotiating with investor counsel and we have to present them that scenario. They say, oh, we're investing $100,000 and yet this is saying you could kick us out for no cost. And I say, well, you can kick them out for no cost if they commit some kind of heinous crime against the company. Is your client planning to commit a heinous crime against the company? And they say, no. And we say, okay, What if another investor does, right? And what
What
if this
about
language
when,
isn't in there?
what about in these days? We've had a lot of situations where sometimes investors, I don't know, they're public figures
Mhm.
and they do something terrible. Like we had one client, I don't know, in an interview talk about his admiration for Adolf Hitler. And, it brought disrepute upon him and also the company because people started looking at the company saying, how can you have this guy as an investor? And these days, the way things spread so quickly, I'm wondering, is there a way that we can prevent that from happening or that we can remove someone for doing something like that?
Is there a way? Yes. Is it common or is it easy? No. There are certain bad acts that are very objective, right? Commission of a crime. There's no interpretation of what that is. That's very clear. You could have clauses that say if they do something, morally reprehensible, or they, do something to negatively affect the reputation of the company, that they're out. But who determines that? And what does that mean? Right? The problem with these moral standing clauses, particularly for investors who aren't involved in the day to day, is investors don't tend to be comfortable with that because who's the arbiter of that? Who decides what is and isn't? Um,
Let me ask another question, and I do understand that.
mhm.
You say sexual harassment. Well, there's two things. There is being accused of it,
Yep.
and then there's being, I don't know, convicted of it.
Mhm.
How do you, we want to get people out if they're accused, at least if they're accused with a credible accusation. How do we deal with that?
The same way you would deal with it normally. There would have to be an investigation, right? It's an accusation generally isn't enough. There has to be an investigation, a third party objective investigation, and you don't necessarily need a conviction from a court. But if the investigation reveals that that happened, or you have enough testimony, enough witnesses, we want to empower you to make that call,
Hmm.
right? So it is a good question, and sexual harassment is absolutely something that should be grounds for removal. If you have an investor who's harassing your customers or staff, they're out of there. Um, and the thing to keep in mind too is some investors expect buyouts. Some investors say, all right, well, you want me out, give me my money back. In hospitality, there's rarely enough money in the bank to allow that to happen. So
Hmm.
you never want to give your investors the right to compel a buyout,
Right.
because that could create a situation where if enough people do that at the same time, the company's out of business.
Hmm.
So all of these forfeitures are important to say, listen, we shouldn't have to suffer financially for your crimes.
Right.
It's a high bar though, right? Your investors could be annoying, they could be rude, they could be, bad people. It's not necessarily going to rise to the level of being able to kick them out for free. So I'd say
Got
most of the time, if there are breakdowns in the relationship between a founder and an investor, it doesn't rise to the level of a crime, and you're stuck having to negotiate a buyout. And you're
it. Hmm.
always 10 times out of 10 going to pay them more to be free of them than you think they should earn. And most cases, the company's right.
Right.
Um, so all this to say, pick your investors carefully. We can protect you as best we can, but there's always a little bit of risk when you enter business with somebody.
Okay. Let's move on.
Um, this is a question we get a lot, which is, how do I incentivize larger investors? And the reason we think it's important to talk about this is the general rule, if you're raising money, is treat all your investors the same, right? You don't want to offer something to one investor that you're not offering to other investors, because if you do that, you don't want to be perceived as playing favorites, right? If you give one investor one thing and you don't disclose to the other investors that they're getting that, and then the dust settles and they look at the deal and they realize, wait, I got a worse deal than somebody else, I didn't know about that. That's an issue, because you technically misrepresented things to the other investors by not disclosing the rights you're giving to some. So if you want to create tiers of investors, you want to create premium packages if investors invest in excess of a certain amount, or you want to get them certain perks, you can. Just make sure you do it evenly across the board, and make sure that that's baked into the term sheet and all the written materials that you're sending to investors. Make sure that all investors have the option to participate in that tier. Um, a good way to incentivize major investors is to just give them things like priority reservations, comp their meals every once in a while, make the benefits relative to the restaurant itself. Try to avoid situations where you're raising $500,000 but you have like 6 classes of equity. It just
Hmm.
becomes very complicated. because you don't know how much everybody's going to invest until they do. And you don't want to have to restructure the deal 18 times to create 6 classes of equity when you might only need 2.
No.
Um, so this is just a question we've gotten enough times this year that we we put this slide in and wanted to just talk about it briefly. You do have ways to incentivize investors to invest more money, but think creatively. Think club membership, subscription, priority reservations, comped meals, that kind of thing. That's an easier way to do it. But there are certainly other options also.
It's great. I think we're up to the question and answer period. So if anyone has any questions about anything we talked about, you can be specific, you can go off page, you can be creative. We've heard them all. So feel free to take a second, put something, we won't say your name, it's confidential, and ask any questions you have. And we'll just hang out for a couple of minutes as the questions start to come in, because everyone's furiously typing right now. And we always get some pretty good questions. If somebody comes into you, Andrew, they're a first timer, what are you telling them their percentage of equity should be just off the bat? Meaning that how much do they have to sell to raise their money? Let's say they're raising $700,000. Where do you start?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's hard to advise in a vacuum. Really depends on what they're doing, but in a vacuum, I'd say they're selling between 30 and 40% of the business.
Yeah.
And they're offering a preferred return of somewhere between 80 and 100% of the profits to that investment group first.
Mm-hmm.
We'd want a ceiling on their management fee. You're probably sharing ownership of the brand, depending on what they want to do, just because you don't have the leverage to say otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's usually in the 30 to 40% range, sometimes as high as 50%, depending on how much money you're raising.
Yeah, we see a lot of first timers come in and say, oh, I need to sell 50 or 60%. And we usually try to scale that back a little bit. You don't have to sell quite that much. Well, it doesn't look like we're getting any questions, which means that you have been so comprehensive that you've covered every possible scenario. Oh, here's one. If we have more than one investor, do they have to know how much the other person invested and the amount of equity that they are getting? Question we hear all the time. That's a good one.
Yes, the answer is yes. You don't necessarily need to disclose the identity of the investors you're talking to, but you do need to disclose once somebody does invest, right? They'll be added to the company's capitalization table. The identity of the members, the amount that they invested, that's all part of the cap table that by law has to be shareable and distributed to all members. So some clients feel that, oh, this, I have a celebrity investing. I don't want anybody to know. It's very hard when you invest in a closely held company. There's really no such thing as anonymity, either from the SLA perspective or from the other investors. That has to be something you're comfortable sharing, because by law, they're entitled to it, regardless of what the contract says. They really have to know that.
That's great. Another question. How frequently do you include a hurdle rate into your preferred return agreements? Also, how about different tiers of preferred returns, like 70%, then 50%, then diluted?
I'm not sure what you mean by hurdle rate, but can there be different tiers of distributions? Absolutely. You could say 100% to investors until they get their money back, then 50% until they make another 50K, and then it's pro rata. You can do it that way. You don't necessarily need to. I think 2 tiers is plenty. What we sometimes see is, you can say we'll give 80% to investors until they recover 110% of their initial investment, right? And then it's pro rata. Mm-hmm. You can do multiple tiers. I think it's less common and it becomes a little tricky to track. I think it's just a little cleaner to do 2 tiers and to figure out what is a fair, hurdle, I guess, to use that term, trigger for the flip, for when the future profits go by equity lines. But we've seen deals where there are like 8 tiers of profit distribution, and it's very complicated. Really depends on the deal you're striking, but my advice would be try to keep it simple and make that first tier sufficient for investors so that future flips can just be along equity lines.
Sounds good. Well, another question. Are there any CPA firms or experts you work with or recommend that help build a deck with comprehensive financials for Raise? We do. You can email me. I will be happy to introduce you to a couple.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any common red flags that an investor should look for when they are being pitched to?
Yeah, and if you're an investor, if they don't have a business plan, that's a huge red flag. They don't have financials. If the company's disorganized, if you're getting different answers from different people, it's a big red flag. You generally want to make sure if you're being pitched as an investor that there's at least a term sheet and there are projections. If there are no projections, if the business plan, if they're saying, oh, we don't know yet, but sign here. If they want you to sign first and ask questions later, it's a big red flag. So you can tell a lot about how buttoned up a company is based on the quality of materials that you're getting, the consistency of the information you're receiving, and just how responsive are they to you.
Good answer. Well, thank you, Andrew. And thank you to everybody for joining us. This is our last webinar of the season, and we will be announcing our spring season in probably a month or so in January. It's been great. Thank you all for attending, so many of them. And as always, if you have any questions, david@helbraunlevey.com or andrew.fine@helbraunlevey.com. We're always happy to answer your questions. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy your Monday. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.